So I hate Chicago in terms of the conversations in this country related to crime, and the reason why is because people often, due to the fact that Chicago is the third largest city in the United States of America, conflate the raw numbers of Chicago with the worst of the worst in the United States, which often leaves them open and vulnerable to attacks from people on the other side that just want to deny crime, because even though Chicago's raw numbers are insane, and their per capita numbers compared to Los Angeles or New York City are also insane, they are nowhere near as bad as Baltimore, Detroit, New Orleans, St. Louis, or similar. In fact, Chicago doesn't even crack the top 10 in terms of most dangerous cities in terms of homicide or violent crime in this country, because again, when you're comparing different populations, the metric that you use is a per capita metric. So if you're going to take one lesson from this video that goes far beyond the individual story that I want to tell you, then remember that whenever you're in a conversation related to crime, the worst cities in the United States of America, and when Chicago specifically is brought up. However, just because Chicago isn't nationally the worst or anything like that, doesn't mean that Chicago isn't getting worse. What we're going to talk about today is a story out of the second city where a 16-year-old was able to commit 12 carjackings over a 7-hour period. That's right, 12, a dozen people lost their cars to a 16-year-old over just a 7-hour period. But before we get into that, I just want to give a quick thank you to everyone who signed up over at actualjusticewarrior.com/join. It really helps a lot, especially for these videos that are unsponsored. I appreciate you. You're my best friend. We'll hang out in real life. Just kidding. If you see me in real life, you can say hi, but don't try to hang out with me. Don't follow me home. It's really weird and uncomfortable.
Jim, police say the 16-year-old is behind a spree of carjacking spread throughout the city. Here in Bridgeport, right here in Bridgeport, 2 young women were targeted. A 16-year-old is facing 16 felony charges today. You heard that right, 16 felonies. Underage, we don't know his name or what he looks like.
Okay, so I just want to point out a couple of things. First and foremost, they're talking about youth offenders, how the youth in Chicago are causing a bunch of problems. I'm not a big fan of the code words. I'm not a big fan of the nonsense that's coming from the local news, but I would let it go if not for the fact that they're like, this 16-year-old offender, because of his young age, we not only don't know his name, but we have no idea what he looks like. I'm willing to bet, based on the fact that they caught another 16-year-old offender, and they did in fact show his face, that you guys can guess a approximate description of what this young individual looks like, especially when you take into account that this was Chicago, the city of Chicago, and who's committing the crimes over there.
But we do know this is how those charges break down. Armed vehicular hijacking, armed robbery, and armed attempted vehicular hijacking, all connected to this list of carjackings. The 16-year-old identified as one of the suspects behind 12 of them in one day.
So this guy was arrested in connection with about a dozen hijackings, and he has a charge for attempted hijacking, meaning that he was going for the baker's dozen before he was eventually arrested. And the timetable on this, because again, it's over a 7-hour period, is actually one of the more impressive things that I've ever seen. They said last year in the city of Chicago, or maybe it was in 2021, getting my years wrong, that they wanted to ban Grand Theft Auto because it was inspiring the youth. And they actually could make the case that maybe it was inspiring this kid in particular, pointing guns at people and doing this many carjackings like he's playing Grand Theft Auto in real life.
Targeting victims throughout the city within hours. We mapped them out so you can see the spread, despite the short time frame. 13 victims between 21 and 66 years old.
Look, I'm not saying anything, but this was a very uneven pace. 12:07 a.m. is when he started, just after midnight. Then his next carjacking was 1:50 in the morning. So he needed a little rest. He had to build up his strength, had to get a snack. Who knows what he did with that car. But then he's out there again nearly at 2 in the morning. And then he lays dormant for a while after carjacking that car. It takes him almost a full hour. And of course, he's all the way on another part of Chicago until 2:44 to carjack another person. And then he really starts picking up the pace. 3:25 and then 3:40, 2 different reported carjackings. 15 minutes in between them. This kid is stealing cars, again, with the use of a firearm, threatening people, and on top of that, he's robbing individual people while he's doing it, so he's really changing up his level of crime. And again, what the hell is being done with each and every one of these cars? But the streak continues. So his next carjacking is at 4:30 in the morning. Then 20 minutes later, very close on this map, he commits another carjacking at 4:50. And at this point in time, I just want to say that if you're the police and theoretically you're responding to the carjacking that went down at that 4:30 location, you have to be able to respond quicker and figure out some way to trap this kid at 4:50. But the thing is, in the city of Chicago, they do not pursue suspects without approval from a commanding officer. Remember, there was that story of the Marine or Army veteran, I don't remember exactly which branch he was from, that was being robbed. Then an old lady shouted at the guys, they got distracted, the guy knocked away the gun and just took off. Well, the police got behind that vehicle. They were in pursuit. They asked permission on whether or not they could chase them. They said no, or they didn't give a response in time, and the default response is no. So those robbers went on to commit several other armed robberies after the police were not allowed to pursue them. So maybe we're in a situation related to that. But again, as you can see based on this chart, he continued on stealing cars, over a dozen total, until 6:45. In fact, I'm kind of burying the lead because the 3 carjackings in the 6 a.m. hour are among the most dramatic. First and foremost, you have one at 6:08. Then just 12 minutes later, even though that carjacking at 6:08 was at his southernmost point, he ends up all the way north in the middle of the city once again, carjacking another person at around 6:20. And then just 20 minutes later, he carjacked another person. And need I remind you that this chart is actually graphing what went down on August 20th of 2022, meaning he did all this, he got away, and this local news segment about him being arrested is from just 3 days ago. So possibly he was arrested on a completely different crime and they somehow figured out this was the person that they were looking for. And that's just how insane one kid, one teenager can get in the city of Chicago. But again, one anecdote or one crazy story is not enough for a whole segment. What you guys need to know is that this is part of a pattern of behavior that we're seeing in the city of Chicago. Because one of the things that the Cook County prosecutor, who is Kim Fox, you might remember her from trying to let Jussie Smollett off the hook, likes to do is not charge youth offenders with the crimes that they're committing at the level that they should be charged. She tries to give them a slap on the wrist, redirect them to community orientation, and all of that. So throughout the city of Chicago, what we're seeing is more and more under 18s committing crimes because their gang leaders are using them to do more of this stuff, knowing that they will face less consequences. They're making them hold guns. We've seen videos of that throughout the city of Chicago, and it has become a game, according to some law enforcement officials, for these kids to go out and carjack people, again, due to the lack of consequences. But if the numbers don't reflect a dramatic increase in carjackings, then what are we even talking about? If Chicago's carjackings were just as they were pre the George Floyd riots, when a lot of new reforms were instituted, then probably we shouldn't be concerned about anything. But here's the thing. We all know that that's not the case. The city of Chicago pre-2019, even though, again, they had huge problems with their murder rate among younger black males, was under 1,000 carjackings per year. After the George Floyd riots, after new reforms at the state level in Illinois, after Kimberly Fox decided she wasn't going to charge any youths with anything because, they're just young Aladdins trying to steal bread for their family, carjackings went up from below 1,000 to over 2,000 every year for the past couple of years. So Chicago more than doubled their rate of carjackings. It's disproportionately under 18s doing it, and people are getting hurt, people are getting killed. I could have covered a murder that happened as a result of a carjacking or any of these other disasters, but what I want you guys to really take home with you, really think about, is the fact that a lot of the people who are getting targeted by these youths doing the carjackings are people who work for Uber or Uber Eats. So their car is actually their livelihood. Now, for a lot of people in the United States of America, whether or not you're driving for a living, your car is intimately connected to your livelihood in that you need that to get to work. And a lot of Americans are very vulnerable to something that happens negative to their car because they wouldn't be able to get to work and all sorts of other problems that would stem from that. However, when your car is actually your mechanism for work and that is being specifically targeted and stolen, it's significantly worse. When you're being killed, when they order food to a location as an Uber Eats driver for your livelihood or seriously injured, there's something worse about that, especially since a lot of people don't tip their Uber Eats drivers. They don't get paid particularly well. Gas has gone up. They have a ton of problems. I know a lot of people have problems in this country. So them being targeted just seems more and more scumbag than it needs to be. And that's what's going on. I could have given you the story of somebody, I think he was driving for Postmates or Uber Eats, that was robbed by 5 kids. They stole his car, ended up totaling it, or any machination of these tales, and it's just absurd.
Earlier this week, we told you about 5 other arrests, all juveniles facing felonies.
So, I laid out the problem for you. I told you what was going on in terms of the carjackings. I told you that there's a dramatic spike in youths committing the carjackings. A lot of police say that it's become more of a game than anything else. They talked about the 5 juveniles that were arrested for carjackings. That is also related to what we were talking about with the Uber Eats situation and all of that. But now we're going to hear from the probation office about what the solution is. And remember, Kim Foxx is still running the district attorney's office. She's still not prosecuting anyone. So get a load what the response the probation office is going to pitch you to a problem that's obviously caused by lax enforcement on under 18 offenders and a woke district attorney who refuses to do her job.
And with more and more teenagers behind violent crime here in Chicago, we turn to those these young people could take their next steps with, the Cook County Juvenile Probation Department, catching up with the acting director and 2 probation officers on the work being done to keep teens from becoming repeat offenders.
We get them engaged in structured supportive services sooner over later. And that's one of the ways that the court has really responded to what we're seeing in this moment, is to be really quick to get young people engaged.
So yeah, that was a lot of words for somebody to say that they're basically going to do nothing. We're going to try to engage these kids with the community. One of their biggest problems is that they are far too engaged with the automobile owning community in that they keep stealing their damn cars. So yeah, the response from the probation officers is that they're going to try to institute midnight basketball, community service, and all of these nonsense, when in reality, we can see that the problem stems from a lack of consequences. So a soft on crime pandering to the criminal, trying to give them some kind of community activity, volunteer at the soup kitchen once a week, isn't going to pull them away from their affiliation with gang members. I'm a big believer in smart probation. I'm a big believer in parole and all these things that have supervision. But when the supervision comes from people who don't care about criminality, who think that the criminals are the victims and think that, oh, I'm going to save them by engaging them in the community, we know the results of that. This is the same probation office that has been dealing with these youthful offenders over the past couple of years. When they stopped enforcing the law against them properly, they shifted more and more over to them, and the failures should be reflected upon them. When the police don't do something right, we point our ire at the police department. But all of a sudden, when it's the probation office, the news segment cuts to them and there's no accountability. They just give a statement. The statement is worthless. It's meaningless. It doesn't actually lay out any consequences, and they move on and they say, oh, well, I hope it works out. I hope if you're one of those 13 people between ages 21 and 67 who got a gun pointed at you and got carjacked and maybe your car was wrecked, who knows, who cares? I hope you're totally fine with that. I hope you're not traumatized or anything like that. I hope if you're the Uber driver that's getting robbed of your livelihood and then they crash it, or somebody who's been killed over their vehicle, also happened with youths in Chicago, I'm sure it will be all right next time, because these probation officers, they got you. Midnight basketball.
So what's next here? We reached out to the Cook County State's Attorney's Office about juvenile offenders. They say they're working directly with CPD's Vehicular Hijacking Task Force.
So then they reach out to the Cook County District Attorney's Office, which is run by Kimberly Fox. She said, we're working with the Carjacking Task Force. But again, what progress do you expect to actually make on carjackings that have more than doubled in the city of Chicago when you're unwilling to institute a sensible pursue policy, i.e. the cops can pursue the criminals? You're unwilling to prosecute these repeat youthful offenders with the seriousness that they need, so they keep getting let back out on the street with the slap on the wrist. And your probation office is only bringing to the table community engagement and soup kitchens and midnight basketball. Obviously, this is not going to get better until something significant changes. It could get worse, because what we see in criminal justice policy in these left-wing cities is that they always find a way to make things worse, to make things more pro-criminal, and we could all suffer the consequences of that. But we shouldn't have to go this way. It doesn't have to be this way. We can change our attitude on crime, show disdain for the criminal, and actually end up creating an environment that deters this behavior rather than enables it. But hey, those are just my thoughts. So let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. If you like this video, show them by leaving a like. You can subscribe for more content. Follow me on all my social media. Support me via the support links in the description box of this video. This has been me talking about insane carjackings in the city of Chicago. Till next time.